Hey, it's Glenn, and this is my video talking about my novella, The Chronicles of Nightfire, Texas, Volume 1, The Vampire Murders. So, as usual, I'm going to start with the origin of this book. It was actually when I was writing Cry Wolf, my first novel, where I fell in love with the town. It was such an interesting concept. You have this town that's protected from werewolves and has been for almost 150 years because it has this vial full of werewolf blood in the basement of a little church. And I don't know, there were such interesting characters in this town, and I just really wanted to write about that town. So it's a spin-off story from Cry Wolf, even though it's set like 25 or 23 years earlier. And I wanted the idea to make it so much earlier is it's a separation, and it gives me plenty of time to develop the town and the characters without running into Cry Wolf and that more specific continuity to that novel. Though there are a number of characters from that novel 23 years younger in this one, and characters with connections to characters in that novel that won't be really revealed until later. But it's one of those things where if I let myself think about something, a story pops in my head. So I thought about Nightfire, Texas, before Cry Wolf, like the previous generation, and it just kind of, it was there. These characters were there waiting for their story to be told, and it's a long story. And it goes to, some of the inspiration for the format of the story, because it was originally serialized on my website in 3 parts, and from 2000 to 2001. And it was replacing the short stories. I'd put up 4 short stories that were free downloads back then. It was before Kindle. I think they were actually put up originally in Microsoft Word documents, and from there they were converted to PDFs. And the whole idea of the freebies on my website was because the novel was coming out, and I wanted something to keep people interested and to keep people coming back to the website even when I didn't have a new book out. So after Cry Wolf came out, I think I put Nightlight Up was the next short story, and then it was the Chronicles of Nightfire, Texas, which was hopefully going to bring people back again and again because of the constant cliffhangers. And it worked. It worked. And it was years later before I found out how many people were actually reading this serial novel, because I didn't know how to check the numbers on my website, and I think I switched URLs a couple of times, and I don't even know the numbers from the early days, but this is one of my most widely read stories, The Chronicles of Nightfire, Texas. And but the inspiration for the format, I've always just really loved soap operas. I think, like, not every soap opera, like my first taste of it was probably Robotech as a kid, and to some extent Voltron, those cartoons that sort of took on a serial format. And I thought it was cool, the idea that not everything is resolved in 20 minutes on this cartoon. I love He-Man, as you can tell from looking behind me, but every story was resolved in that half-hour format, except, they had one cliffhanger episode on the original He-Man, but, Voltron, some were like that, but it would always build, and Robotech was a total soap opera where you'd have to keep tuning in day after day to see what happened next, and It's just the idea of a continuing story where you don't have to say goodbye to whatever's going on. It builds, it's not diminished by the requirements of wrapping everything up in a half hour. So you can tell bigger stories, you get more out of the characters and the settings that way. And I think after that, you know, the soap operas, I was crazy about Dark Shadows, and I'm talking about the 90s reboot that only ran like 12 episodes or something, but it was fantastic. And I had seen the original in reruns when I was a kid, but I didn't really remember it. It wasn't like something I watched every day when I was a little kid. I don't think my mother would have stood for it. She had problems with Scooby-Doo, so I don't think she would have let me watch Dark Shadows if she had known that I was watching it. But the 90s reboot with Ben Cross as Barnabas Collins, I was so hooked. Because, I mean, this show's so weird. Like, not only is it serial format where, you know, the story it continues from week to week without resolution, but one of the characters is a freaking vampire. And, I mean, that was just so bizarre to me. But after that, I mean, that didn't last very long. But just the format, the soap opera format, I was just crazy about that whole thing. And I think the next thing I got hooked on was Knots Landing. I loved Knots Landing. I'm not ashamed to say it. Did not like Dallas, probably because I live in Dallas, and I felt like that show was ridiculous and did not represent real life Dallas or people who live there at all. But Knots Landing, I was crazy about Knots Landing because, I mean, it was ridiculous, it was dramatic, and it was just fun. The whole premise was just fun. And Days of Our Lives, one summer, my friends and I all got hooked on Days of Our Lives. So I'm rambling about soap operas, but Days of Our Lives also, I got hooked on it, not just because it was a soap opera, but because it was weird. Like, when I got hooked on it, it was the summer that one of the characters was possessed by the devil. And, you know, I think at some point, either just before that, or sometime around there, one of the characters was an alien. And just the whole idea of being able to tell an over-the-top, weird story and just keep it going was so compelling to me. And so when I had this opportunity to write about Nightfire, Texas in the 1970s, well, set it in 1974, it has so much room to breathe in that universe before we get to the 1990s, the late 1990s, that it gave me kind of a canvas to paint a long-running soap opera onto. And the characters, like, there are I view it as four protagonists, really. And they all serve different functions. It's these four guys, and you've got Bradley Stevens, who, he's the character that things happen to. And you've got Sam Turner, and he's the character he's kind of like the witness. He's sort of got his fingers in everything, whether he wants to or not. He just kind of inadvertently is in the middle of everything. And Ray Dawn, if you look at Bradley is the character who things happen to, Ray is the character who happens to things. Like, if there's a situation, Ray happens to it. He's like an event all into himself. And then Val and Alexis. Again, spoilers. If you don't want to know what happens in this series, turn it off now, come back later. Okay, so Valen is a vampire, which, yeah, Dark Shadows did that. But And that's become kind of a thing. Like the Vampire Chronicles picked up, I think, the torch of Dark Shadows in the mid 70s with Interview with the Vampire, and just the idea of a vampire being more than just a blood-sucking monster. The vampire having this history and remembering who they were before they were a vampire. And I mean, I think Valen Alexis falls into that category of vampire where he's trying to pass as human, not to catch them in his web so much as just because he doesn't want to let go of his humanity. And that's the important thing about Valen, is that he reminds us he's a metaphor. He's all of us. He's the monster, but he's human. And he's kind of a contrast, like you see in this series. The real monsters are the people. And that everyone has something inside of them that could become a monster that they have to keep in check. And that's Valen in this series, especially when I get into book 3, which hasn't even come out yet, but it's all about what monsters humans can be. And so you've got this blood-sucking creature of the night who's not the worst thing in the town. He's not the person you need to be afraid of. Because, I mean, this first story is about a serial killer. And the other thing about Valen was, I was tempted not to have a supernatural character in this story, because to me it's about human beings. That was what was compelling to me about the town and the characters from the werewolf novel I wrote. But if I write this series and we don't have a supernatural element to it, and it's just about normal human beings, then if you're reading everything in the universe chronologically and then you get to Cry Wolf, it seems out of place. Like, then the original doesn't fit, because all of a sudden you go from realistic human stories to a werewolf. So it was necessary, even though this is a human story, this is a story about a serial killer, it's necessary to have a supernatural element. And I couldn't use a werewolf because at this point on the timeline, werewolves cannot enter Nightfire, Texas. So, I just ask the universe questions and the answer is vampire. And even though, yes, Dark Shadows did it, I kind of embraced that as an homage, because this character, he is not, in my opinion, he's not the same character as Barnabas Collins. He's not the same character as Lestat or Louis from the Anne Rice novels. He's his own character. And so I was comfortable with that, and I couldn't think of a better, I couldn't really make one of the main characters a ghost. That would be way too limiting. A vampire can pass for human. And so he can participate in all of these human stories while reminding us where this story came from in the first place, which was a werewolf novel. And not letting me ever forget that and get too far away from that. And it's worked out tremendously well. And, but anyway, so you have Valen, who wants to be accepted as a human being. I mean, that's the other thing. I mean, with it being a human story, it's about social issues. It's about history. It's set in the early 1970s, at least when it begins. And I think one of the things I was very, very uncomfortable with in this setting was trying to be true to what I witnessed as a child in the 1970s and even in the 1980s, where there was this casual racism that was just everywhere. And I don't know if that was different if you didn't live in the South, but I grew up in Texas, and I grew up in big cities, Dallas and Houston. I lived in Garland, which is a suburb of Dallas, but even in these big cities, racism was everywhere. And when I was a child, it didn't strike me as malicious. I didn't really recognize it for what it was until I was older and started to realize how awful these words were that adults around me would just throw out like it was nothing, like the N-word. I loathe the N-word. And in order to be true to the time and place that this novel is set in, I had to let characters use it and use it casually, because that's the way it was. And so I'm very conscious of the racism in this story. It's been on sort of a trajectory where it's going to come to a head of sorts in book 3. So it's a good thing. I worry about this book being perceived as racist itself, because there are a lot of things in there just to get the story started that probably come off that way. Like, as I said, the casual racial slurs, the one of the characters comes in bragging about beating up some black people and says some awful things, and his friend calls him on it, but not too strongly. And my battery's about to die. Hold on. Okay, I'm back. So, like, Bradley calls his friend out on being a racist, but he's not that upset about it if you're reading it. It just is kind of an accepted thing. He's just like, oh, that's not cool. You shouldn't be a racist and beat up black people and call them horrible things. But it's sort of a part, like, the fact that all of these characters are ignorant on some level gives us some place to go. There's a lot of eye-opening that happens even in chapter 1 of this book, because they meet, like, you have Bradley and Ray, it's, all the white people hanging out, and they meet a black person who's getting beat up by Mexicans, and there are a lot of slurs thrown out there too by Ray, who's not supposed to be a bad guy. He's not really supposed to be a racist, but it's the fact that people can be racist without knowing that they're being racist, especially when you're in a culture that permits it, that a culture where it's a casual thing, and you're white and you have white privilege, and you just don't see how bad it is what you're doing. And and here's the other thing is Sam. Like, Sam is on purpose. He starts out as sort of a stereotypical token black character of that time period that you would see on television and movies. There'd be the black friend, but he's not. Like, a lot of times, I hated this, the black character was comic relief. Like, he was a clown, and Sam is not a clown. And you see that in more recent years with gay characters. Into the 1990s and the early 2000s, gay characters were treated as clowns. They weren't fully realized people, they were just there to laugh at, pretty much. And I feel like that's how black people were treated. That's how token blacks were treated in stories in the 1970s. If you don't believe me, watch Airplane or something. It's so Sam is kind of falling into that role inadvertently. He's rescued by white people. It's it's everything you would criticize in a story by today's standards dealing with race, but it's intentional because Sam is also ignorant. It's kind of a, as the witness of the story, Sam needs to experience these eye-opening moments. He's been sheltered to a large degree for his whole life and somehow just kind of missed the memo. And especially in book 2, he starts getting called out on it by his family and his girlfriend, and he starts questioning how he is perceived by all of his white friends. And you know, it's complicated. I don't even know like how to get into it without just going on for hours and hours and hours. But the social issues of the time are very important, and that's kind of something I'm going to do with the series as it goes forward, is look at history and address what was going on with the human race at any given time that these books are going to be set as it moves forward in time. And I think in the early 1970s, race is a big one. And, you know, I mean, just the idea that there's this gray area where the good guys aren't completely good and the bad guys aren't completely, well, no, the bad guys, the racists are completely bad in this story, but, well, actually, okay, book 3, we'll talk about that when we get there. It hasn't even come out, but it's called White Devils, if that gives you any hint where this series is going. But, right, so to me, I think Sam is one of the most crucial characters in here. And I feel like I started with 4 guys, but you're going to see all of the side characters are going to be a little bit more center stage as we move forward. You'll see that in book 2 already. And it's just, for this small story, this small first story arc, I had to start with a smaller group of lead characters. And it was small, like 3 episodes, that makes up the first storyline. The second storyline, it took 12 installments to do. And that's really going to be the format moving forward, is the novels are going to be broken into 12 parts and serialized. And I almost, when the collections came up, because this wasn't collected into hardback until 2013, I think. Let me look real quick, because I like to not be wrong. Yes, 2013. So it was like 12 years after the serialization of the first 3 had concluded that it was collected. So I almost put all 15 installments of the serial novel into one book, but I really felt like this was its own story, and so that's why it's such a short book. See, it's like 125 pages, but it really needed to be its own book when it came to collecting these stories, because episode 4 of the serial really started a new storyline. I mean, it definitely picks up from here because it's a soap opera, but if this were a TV series, this would be season 1, next book would be season 2, and they all have kind of their own meta stories within a larger meta story, and so that's why this one's separate, even though it's really short. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I need to say about this book or the characters. This is why it would be cool if I had like someone I'm talking to who could ask me things that I didn't bring up. Because I always, when I turn off the camera, I'm like, oh, I should have talked about this, or I should have said that. But, you know, there's time. Hopefully I'm not going anywhere. Periodically I can come back. If people send me questions about books, when I get enough questions about the same book, I'll do another video and talk to whatever I didn't before. Meanwhile, this book is, if you're watching this video on September 15th of 2016, this is the last day that it's free in Kindle format. It'll probably be free again at some point, I don't know. But for now, this is the last day that it's free. Usually it's only like $2.99, and there's also a hardback and a trade paperback, which looks the same, but it's floppy. And don't fall. Okay. And the ebook on Kindle. Unlike most of my books, though, the hardback you can only get through lulu.com. I'm not sure why that is. Ingram does not carry, and that's the big provider to all the bookstores, they don't carry the hardback of Volume 1. The trade paperback you can get anywhere. The ebook you can get through Amazon, and if you have a Kindle app, it doesn't matter if you have a Kindle. So there you go. I mean, there's a link at my website to get the hardback from Lulu if you want it. Website's glennslade-clark-jr.com. And I know there's so much more I need to say about this book. It's not coming to mind right now. So if you have questions about this book, if you read it at any point, just send me your questions. I'll keep a collection of questions, and I will periodically do Q&A videos or whatever and make sure that every aspect of this book and any book that needs to be addressed will be addressed. So until next time, have fun, and I'll talk to y'all later.